Welcome to the Gen Z Marketer podcast, where we have marketing conversations and everything in between. Today's episode is under the MarkeTips series, and let's talk about social media planning. This episode is sponsored by The Modern Fashionista. They are a local clothing brand that has quality clothes at affordable prices for everyday Filipinas. Check them out on Facebook, Instagram, and Shopee as The Modern Fashionista. Now, let's talk about social media planning. I've been doing this for pretty much the whole duration of my career. And what I can tell you is that social media planning is pretty consistent across the board, but it's not a one size fits all kind of thing. I've planned content for fashion brands, FMCG brands, and even travel industry. And what I've really noticed is that it's pretty much consistent, but the way you do it would differ depending on the brand and depending on the types of content that you want to put out. So, why is social media planning important? Of course, social media on its own now is a marketing tool or is a marketing strategy. And basically, with strategy, there's planning. And social media planning is important because it's also a form of content marketing. And for you or for any brand now, I think one of the key things is to really put out content regularly, specifically for social media, because everyone is on social media now. Especially here in the Philippines, we're really a Facebook dominated country. A lot of people are using Facebook. So it's really important to have a social media plan or strategy out there. So social media is actually another way for people to, or maybe it's one of the primary ways that people discover your brand. And usually, when they look through your feed, when they look through your page, whatever your social media page looks like is pretty much giving them a first impression on your brand. So, of course, this is also why social media is important or social media planning is important because it's an application of your branding as well and it influences brand perceptions. Let's say you don't post that often. People might think you're not an active brand or an active business. Let's say you mostly post not so good photos, so people might get confused or disencouraged to engage with your brand and all of these things. This is why it's important to also really have a social media strategy. And of course, as we mentioned, social media is already a marketing strategy on its own, and it's usually a part of the whole marketing plan. So maybe you use social media to support your influencer marketing campaign. Maybe you have a new product coming out. Maybe you have new services to offer. All of these things, ultimately, social media now is really a huge component or a huge contributor in the whole marketing plan. So, how do you plan your social media strategy? How do you do social media planning? Well, first, one factor that I think really contributes, based on my experience, is really the business structure or the brand structure, basically, how you do things in the business. And for instance, for fashion is something that's highly visual and it's a lifestyle industry. So ultimately, you need to put out content if not every day, then almost pretty much every day. You need to have lifestyle shots, you need to have product shots, you need to have shots of real people. And so what we did there, what I did with some of the fashion brands I worked with, we usually plan out content 2 weeks in advance or a month in advance because you also have to make sure that your content is timely or it's timing up with merchandise release, for instance. So I collaborated with the merchandising team to make sure that I know which styles are coming out and when they're coming out, so that you make sure you post them on the time that they do come out. So that's one. Another experience is when I worked in travel. You have to consider the seasons also. Of course, in fashion, this also works. You have to consider the seasons. Basically, if it's, let's say, a travel season of, let's say, it's summer, you need to put out summer related content. Or if it's, let's say, a holiday, you need to put out holiday or travel related content. Basically, you have to consider a lot of things in the business, in the industry, and what you're doing when you do social media planning. Yeah, it's really a strategic. That's the really one of the strategic parts of it, that you need to make sure your timing is on point when you put out the content. Because ideally, when you put out the content, it would be relevant to that time when you posted it or when you put it out. Of course, you can put out summer travel content during Christmas, right? So that's one of the examples, or that's one of the things you do really. It's about timing, business structure, and all of these things. Next, you need to evaluate which platforms do you want to participate in, which platforms do you want to be active in. You have Facebook, you have Twitter, you have Instagram, you even have TikTok and YouTube. So, in my experience or in my recommendation, as I said before, it's not one size fits all. So, sometimes your business or your brand may not be relevant to a certain platform based on the user behavior in those platforms. For instance, Twitter is not really a strong contender for brands here in the Philippines. So maybe for your business, well, it ultimately depends on your business, because if you're a service oriented business, like let's say you're an airline or you're a telecommunications company, Twitter is still relevant because that's where customers air out their concerns sometimes or most of the time. But for some businesses, Twitter doesn't really have engagement anymore. It's not relevant, at least here in the Philippines. And maybe TikTok is not relevant for your business because it's a really young platform, meaning most of the people that use it are really Gen Z. So if your audience or your target is not from Gen Z, then maybe TikTok is not relevant to you. So you have to evaluate all of these things, all of these platforms and the behavior, and decide which ones would you be active in. Now that you've decided on the platform, of course, you need to decide on what kinds of content or types of content you would be putting out, because in these platforms, they have usually different kinds of content, specifically to Facebook and Instagram. You have posts, you have videos, you have stories, or you can even do reposts as long as you get the consent of your audience or your customers. So you need to decide which content would you like to produce, which kind of content do you have the resources to produce, right? Because sometimes you don't have enough resources to produce videos. So ultimately, it depends on all of these things. You need to decide what kind of content you have the resources to do or to post. And of course, you've decided on a type of content, you need to have some sort of visual board or style direction with the types of content that you post. I mean, what kind of photos are you going to post? Are they product shots or lifestyle shots? So you should create like a mood board that will guide you when it comes to social media posting. Of course, this should be an extension of your branding. So basically, what kind of brand you want to emulate should be reflected in these photos or in these content visual boards. You need to have this visualization to guide you so that you're not just scampering around and trying to think really hard on what kind of content you need to build. This would be helpful for you to know, lessen time about thinking about the kind of content that you would be posting. So next, other than the content, other than the visual aspect of the social media content, you also have copywriting, which is your captions. Or sometimes if you have a short text on your photo or your videos, that's also copywriting. So how long are your texts going to be? What kind of tone would you have in these texts? Are you a casual brand? Are you a funny brand? Are you a serious brand? Like all of these things you need to consider. And remember to always kiss when you're creating these content or copywriting. Kiss meaning keep it simple, sweetie. Keep it short, sweetie. We have shorter attention spans now, so ideally your copywriting is not that lengthy since this is social media. But of course, in different kinds of marketing, maybe other lengths would work. But ultimately, for social media, it has to be short and sweet. And of course, you need to use your hashtags. If you have brand hashtags, ideally you do have brand hashtags. And then, of course, there are also generic hashtags that you could participate in. And lastly, when you plan social media content, scheduling is important because there's really a time where people are mostly engaged in using social media or their phones. It's usually during lunchtime, it's usually during Wednesdays or Thursdays in the afternoon because sometimes people are bored while working on those days. So you need to consider all of these things. Do you post at lunchtime? Do you post in the evening? Do you post before lunch? And usually, by experience here in the Philippines, those are the times that you post. But again, as I said before, it's not one size fits all. So it depends on your brand, your industry, your audience. You need to understand what time or what kind of content they would engage with. Like all of these things, you really need to consider before you decide when you schedule your campaigns or your posts. So I hope these tips or these insights helped you and made you really think or evaluate on what you will do when you plan your social media content. I am actually planning to share a social media plan template that you could use. I do have some that I have been using for the past few years, but it has also evolved ever since. So I'd like to ask, what do you guys want to see in a social media plan template? Let me know at our socials at the Gen Z Marketer on Facebook, at Gen Z MKT on Instagram, anchor.fm/Gen Z MKT, or at genzmkt.com. Leave me a message there to share your thoughts and your insights as well. Or, of course, if you want to collaborate with me, just leave me a message. Don't forget to follow the podcast to get notified on the latest uploads.